Welcome to Stories of Impact. In every episode, we travel the world to explore intersections of science and spirituality. I'm your host, writer Tavia Gilbert, and along with journalist Richard Sergey, every first and third Tuesday, we look through a new lens at old traditions, hear from new generations as they dream up innovative solutions, and learn new ways to make sense of modern life. This is Stories of Impact, the art and science of human flourishing. In our last episode, we met Dr. Adam Cohen, social psychologist and psychologist of religion at Arizona State University. He and Dr. Catherine A. Johnson, ASU Associate Research Professor, shared their discoveries about the positive impact of fasting on the Jewish high holiday of Yom Kippur. Today, we're in conversation with three researchers, including Dr. Cohen, who share another project that explores the way religious ritual connects participants more deeply, not only with their faith, but with their community. This time, not through the practice of abstaining from food, but by breaking bread together. Dr. Cohen sets the stage by explaining his somewhat unusual attraction to the scientific study of spiritual faith.
I've long been interested in how religion might promote good life outcomes for people, things like physical health, mental health, good community support, and integration. In psychology, religion has not really been taken that seriously at all.
But Dr. Cohen has taken it seriously, and over the course of multiple studies investigating how world religions affect communal well-being, he has come to understand the science of spiritual faith more deeply. And one of his core beliefs is not exclusive to followers of any specific religion. It's a universal human truth.
People like to get together with a shared purpose and a shared identity. They like to share food together. That solidifies their sense of connection.
Each Friday year-round, Jews worldwide gather to break bread over Shabbat dinner, the Jewish day of rest. Traditionally, those who observe Shabbat gather in community to light candles, read from the Torah, pray, and sit around a table to share a meal. And Dr. Cohen has always thought that
Shabbat dinner almost certainly does have a good effect on people's social connection and maybe other indicators of well-being. I think that wisdom is present in lots of spiritual traditions.
And Dr. Cohen's colleagues, including Dr. Arielle Levites, had the same idea, that perhaps Shabbat was a practice with measurable impact. Here's Dr. Levites.
We share that hypothesis that the components altogether, Friday night, food, shared intention, that will see perhaps some interaction effects where we see some of the strongest social connection and belonging outcomes there.
Dr. Levites, managing director of the Collaborative for Applied Studies in Jewish Education and a research assistant professor in the Graduate School of Education and Human Development at George Washington University, also thought that Shabbat dinner might provide a template for enhancing social connection, not only for Jews, but for anyone.
Jews and the American Jewish community have long believed that Shabbat lends some kind of binding structure to community. We see a lot of initiatives that if you want to build community or you want to bring people in who have been sort of peripheral, let's say, to the Jewish community, the way that you do that is that you have a Shabbat dinner.
So the research team imagined a study that could answer the question,
does Shabbat dinner as a spiritual practice increase social connectedness?
That question was personal to her because of one of her core beliefs.
We cannot flourish alone. We need to understand flourishing as a group project. Historically, the academic study of religion, the kinds of experiences it promoted that was very focused on the individual's personal, internal, emotional experience. And that in the study of religion and flourishing, that has often been foregrounded historically. There are traditional modes in which Judaism has something really important to say to our shared conversation about what flourishing can look like.
So Dr. Cohen and Dr. Levites enlisted the participation of Aliza Kline, founding president and then CEO of OneTable, an organization designed to help young Jews develop the independence and the confidence to observe the ritual of Shabbat dinner in their homes and to share the experience with their friends and loved ones. Kline was enthusiastic about doing a research project that would dive deep into the data about whether Shabbat dinner had the potential to increase flourishing.
What does it mean to have new data that uplifts a home-based practice, that enables people to create this sense of connection inside their own home with a lot of validity? If we actually have data that can say, you too can create this, and people will leave potentially with a stronger connection to each other and to your greater community, then maybe it helps other institutions have permission to think more creatively about how their members are engaging with each other, just maybe not on their property.
So what did OneTable's design offer Dr. Cohen and Dr. Levites and the research team? Kline says,
there's a couple of things that are unique to OneTable's particular kind of Shabbat dinner intervention. OneTable provides guidance, suggestions, guardrails. We provide what we call nourishment credit, which is actually financial support to take the burden off of hosting 8 or 10 people. Maybe you want to order in some food. Maybe you need an actual table or chairs to serve this. Maybe you need a traditional ritual object. You tell us what you need.
Since Kline founded OneTable over a decade ago, OneTable has facilitated more than 120,000 DIY Shabbat dinners with over 250,000 participants, with those numbers increasing every single week.
It's not about a synagogue. There isn't a professional Jew or a rabbi, for example, who is facilitating ritual for others. The OneTable design is a DIY with support, home-based approach. And all of our hosts are volunteers. And the idea is that they themselves, they reflect their guests. So they're in their 20s and 30s. They are coming from a wide range of Jewish backgrounds. They are most likely to be Jewish, but their partner or their friends or their guests could absolutely be people from all different backgrounds. So it becomes their own identity supported by the platforms.
OneTable began to address a growing problem: loneliness and dissociation from Jewish community, especially among young people.
Since the beginning, OneTable has been incorporating measures around social connectedness and loneliness. A desired outcome is greater social connectedness. Close to 50% of our participants are Gen Z identified now. This was a population of young adults who were disassociating from Jewish life as they were from all kinds of institutional affiliations, according to Pew Research. And there was also an epidemic of loneliness that was coming out in many different places, including UCLA studies, both disproportionately affecting young adults. Yet we saw young adults clearly looking for ways to connect with each other, just not finding them through traditional channels.
And that was the key to making OneTable uniquely suited to partner in the Shabbat Dinner Project, says Dr. Cohen.
A real strength of this project is this is really taking seriously the idea that a spiritual exercise like a Friday night dinner could have a positive effect, for example, on people's loneliness and feelings of connection. But from an experimental point of view, it's breaking apart this practice into its possible active ingredients. We're asking, is food necessary? Or is a group of people getting together with a shared purpose, is that enough? Is a bunch of people eating together, is that enough? Or do you need a sacred purpose? Does this need to be at a sacred time, for example, Friday night? Or is any time a bunch of people getting together with a shared purpose and sharing food, is that enough? And by doing all possible combinations, we're trying to figure out which of these ingredients you need, either singly or together, in order to increase social connection.
Dr. Levites agreed that OneTable was ripe for research.
There's something about Shabbat dinner that helps us connect is, I think, a working hypothesis that's actually shared among a lot of people who work in the Jewish communal sphere. People who aren't Jewish and are designing programs around shared meals actually also share that hypothesis, that there are other programs that exist right now in this building civic dialogue space or providing interfaith opportunities, all these kinds of initiatives. A lot of them actually had experiences of a Jewish ritual meal. Sometimes they cited Shabbat dinner, sometimes they cited a Passover Seder, but they had some experience of a Jewish ritual meal, even if they themselves were not Jewish, that they thought was powerful. And I think that they've been quite respectful in how they've interpreted that to inform the design of their own programs. It's somehow inspired by that.
With Shabbat as a template for Jews and non-Jews alike to potentially achieve greater community connection and personal flourishing, Dr. Levites says the research team designed the study to explore
this idea of spiritual or religious practices that might contribute to flourishing in some way,
and to test the impact of what they believed might be.
Some of the key facets are a host who either individually invites guests or makes their table open for others, shared food, shared sacred time, and shared intention.
The 2-year research project began in November 2022 with interviews, focus groups, and a study of 8 variations on the typical Friday night Shabbat dinner experience. What did Kline hope to discover when the team began the project?
When they had a wonderful, meaningful Friday night dinner with others, and then understanding the barriers that keeps people away from that, and then designing solutions.
And Dr. Levites' hopes?
I went into this study with the assumption that we'll come out at the other end with something useful to say to people who are in the work of Jewish engagement, to people who are in the work of interfaith dialogue, to people who are in the work of civic engagement. And so we did try and think really carefully about how we built this so that at the end we could use what we learned to help lots of kinds of communities grow and contribute to social connection.
Kline wanted to learn more about the science behind the ritual, a ritual she'd thought deeply about for years.
There is something that is a sacred act of breaking bread. In the Jewish tradition, we say a blessing over the bread, really thinking about the role of the breath of life that was inspired, where the seeds grew and how it cultivated and how we partner with God to bring this bread forth. And whether people are thinking about the full intentionality of that prayer, or they're just saying, actually breaking bread is a sacred act so much that we have blessings around it, there is an understanding. That piece is very powerful. The table is an opportunity where everybody is equal. All right, when we're standing up, we have tall people and short people, and we have all different sizes. But when we're at the table, it's an equalizer. A round table is even better because there's an opportunity to be able to kind of lean in and share that creates an elevated experience. Religiously, the table is also the image of the altar. When the temple was no longer the central place for sacrifice in Jewish community experience and practice, we're now on our own without the temple. The table itself actually becomes that altar. So there is a whole rich and sacred tradition about the table. I mean, there's so much there to be unpacked. And I don't think you have to go quite that deep to enjoy the feeling of being at a table with somebody, but it sure is there if you're ready for it.
Did the research project back up her assumptions?
One of the things that we have learned is that, and especially it's articulated so clearly from millennials and now Gen Z, which is the population we're really focusing on right now, is that social gatherings can actually be sources of anxiety. There are a lot of barriers that keep people from showing up at something and then navigating that space.
What else did the research uncover? Dr. Levites says,
we found that there are more improvements to participating in a Shabbat dinner than doing other social things on a Friday night alone. On some of the measures of loneliness, people marked themselves or assessed their state of being as less lonely than it was on the pretest. For some of our measures of social well-being and connectedness, they marked themselves as feeling more connected to others or more of a sense of belonging after than before. So when we are talking about more improvement, we mean people feeling less lonely, more connected, and feeling a greater sense of well-being. We actually did not find anything that seemed to have a significant effect on being the primary driver or like a key driver of those improvements. It didn't matter if you liked the food. It didn't matter if you lit Shabbat candles or said a blessing over the challah. It didn't matter if you went to the gathering with a close friend or were less well connected to the people there. So all of these things that we imagined would perhaps be positioned to make an important contribution to somebody's outcomes after a Shabbat dinner, none of those things proved to be a clear driver of those improvements. And that is not entirely, but largely true for most of the measures across all of the gatherings. But Friday people who gathered on Fridays showed more improvements than people who gathered on Tuesdays.
Participants may not have cited the quality of food as a factor in whether or not they felt less lonely, but Dr. Levites was still surprised to discover that food could be a barrier to a fully flourishing Shabbat dinner.
What we actually found was the food conditions showed less improvement than the no food conditions. So people who did not have food at their gathering showed more improvements. They rated themselves as less lonely, and they scored themselves higher on measures of well-being and social connection compared to people who did have food at their gatherings. And that was a big surprise to us.
So what's her assessment of those results?
My interpretation is actually that it's probably a lot of things all together, meaning that there is no silver bullet and there is no hack. This study would suggest that it's the whole package of Shabbat dinner that matters, as opposed to any one individual piece that you can easily pull out.
However, Dr. Levites reports that the research still supports what she, Dr. Cohen, and Aliza Kline thought might prove to be true.
In its sort of whole form, with integrity to actually what Shabbat dinner is on a Friday, with food, with people being able to make the choices about what it meant to welcome the Sabbath with their friends, then we actually did find more improvements for that group in our measures of social connectedness than for people who did other things with other people. It does seem as though, yes, Shabbat dinner is a lever for social connectedness.
It's exciting that the research substantiates long-held assumptions about religious ritual.
Shabbat dinner is meaningful for building a sense of social connectedness, for mitigating loneliness, for improving belonging. That actually is bearing out in our research. So gathering on Fridays and Shabbat dinner both seem to demonstrate a greater capacity for improvements in terms of your orientation or feelings about humanity. So they're good for sort of sparking a warm feelings about all of humanity, and actually surprisingly less good for developing feelings of connection and belonging to other Jews.
Less good? That was another surprising finding. The reason, says Dr. Levites, is that Shabbat dinner provided a space for Jews to bring their authentic selves and to take some risks in how they related to others across the table. And that's not always comfortable.
We actually asked people all of the things they talked about on their Friday night with others, right? We know that already Shabbat dinner is a place in which feelings about challenges associated with October 7th, including anti-Semitism and Israel-Palestine, that's a place where that actually surfaces for people and plays out for people. And people talk about different things at a Shabbat dinner than they talk about in other kinds of social gatherings. So there are three things that people talk about at a Shabbat dinner that they don't talk about at another kind of social gathering. And those things are Jewish identity, Israel, and anti-Semitism. That's probably not shocking that those things are more likely to show up at a Shabbat dinner, but I think it can point to the ways in which the conversations at a Shabbat dinner can bring up feelings that are very intense, can bring up disagreements, and surface potentially polarizing ideas. And so people are talking about hard things at a Shabbat dinner. And I think that is another thing when we think about how Shabbat dinner is not just a Friday night, right? It's not just that it has more improvements. It does a better job of mitigating loneliness. It increases social well-being more than other kinds of things. It's also a venue for different kinds of discussions. And those are sometimes hard discussions.
What will the research team do now that they have their findings? Dr. Cohen and Dr. Levites will continue to study the intersection of science and spirituality and to look for practical interventions that can be scaled to help individuals and communities flourish. And Kline?
We're now experimenting with older adults to see what it looks like to actually help them. Those who are at the stage of life where if they had kids at home, they no longer do, maybe they're empty nesters or transitioning into retirement. Now, older generations are also moving, sometimes to be near their kids, and they are starting a new stage of life with the same lack of rootedness that the young adults have. So we have started experimenting. We're calling it Together at OneTable, and it is specifically designed for people who are in this new stage of life. Some of the same exact barriers that were uncovered when we designed this for young adults are also showing up, right? Some of the same concerns that we are trying to figure out, okay, how do we help someone go from the motivation to meet people and have a really beautiful, comforting, welcoming, intellectually rigorous Friday night dinner in someone's home? How do we go from the concept to the practice, to the reality of it?
In the future, Kline hopes that the Shabbat dinner study allows organizations like OneTable a framework to offer the enrichment of Shabbat to more people, whether or not they identify as Jewish.
This study, to me, is incredibly exciting because there's been a lot of movement in terms of understanding social isolation and disconnectedness. The idea that religion can actually be an antidote to loneliness and an asset in terms of social connectedness seems so obvious to me, but that's because I come from a religious and community leading background. And the question is actually true for the general population? And if so, how might we create this intervention on an even larger scale so that more people have social connection? We actually have clients who are outside of the Jewish community. One is called the Dinner Party. The Dinner Party is a beautiful platform that was also started by a millennial to acknowledge that young adults, some of whom have had a personal loss in their family, and they need community. So they have a platform by which a young person can find other young people to have a beautiful, curated conversation about loss around the dinner table. So it's a beautiful expansion of OneTable. Those same folks are involved in the People's Supper and other gatherings that have been designed specifically at times of high polarization, like we are in America right now, to bring people together, whether it's for a Sunday dinner in a religious context or a Tuesday dinner in terms of bringing together people who are specifically across political spectrum. What are the benefits of making it a ritual where there is the shared food, the intentionality, the cause that's bigger than yourself? If those three ingredients turn out to be essential and in different frames, that'll be really clarifying for people who are also struggling to bring people together and need to know the right ingredients to do it.
Our series about the science of religious ritual comes to a close with our next episode, so we hope you'll come back in 2 weeks for that final uplifting exploration. In the meantime, we hope you'll share an intentional meal with a loved one. And we also hope that you'll follow the Stories of Impact podcast and that you'll recommend us to a friend. If you have 1 more minute, it would be great if you could give us a 5-star rating and a review. And we'd be thrilled to hear from you. You can find us at our new website, storiesofimpact.org. This has been the Stories of Impact podcast with interviews by Richard Sergey and Tavia Gilbert. Written and produced by Tavia Gilbert for Talkbox Productions. Assistant producer Oscar Falk. Music by Alexander Filipiak. Mix and master by Kayla Elrod. Executive producer Michelle Cobb. The Stories of Impact podcast is generously supported by Templeton World Charity Foundation.